I was always an average guy living an average life. I was happily married to my wife for 10 years, and we had a pretty good life together. However, something inside me felt like it was missing. I felt like I needed a change or some sort of excitement in my life. That's when I stumbled upon a girl on Facebook. She was only 21 years old, but she was breathtakingly beautiful. We started chatting, and before I knew it, we were talking every day. It felt like a thrill to have someone new and exciting to talk to, someone who made me feel alive again. At first, I told myself that it was just harmless flirting, but soon enough, our conversations turned more intimate. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't help myself. The thought of having something new and exciting was too alluring. One day, the girl suggested that I come to visit her in a small town in California. I hesitated at first, but I couldn't resist the temptation. I told my wife that I was going on a work vacation with my employee, and off I went. When I arrived at the small town, I was taken aback by how beautiful the girl was in person. We spent a few days together, exploring the town and having the time of our lives. It was like a dream come true. However, little did I know, my wife had caught on to my lies. She had been suspicious for a while and decided to follow me without me knowing. It took her 5 hours to reach the small town, but when she did, she caught me red-handed. I freaked out and pushed the girl out of the way, arguing with my wife instead. But she was too angry and hurt to listen to me. She yelled at me for lying to her, and in that moment, I knew our marriage was over. She got in her car and drove off, leaving me behind. I chased after her, but she was driving too fast. I couldn't catch up to her, and then I saw a huge car accident in front of me. The scene was chaotic with people gathered around the wreckage of the car, screaming and crying. I stumbled out of my car in shock, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the upside-down vehicle. Glass shards littered the road, and the smell of gasoline filled the air. I recognized my wife's purse on the ground beside the car, and my stomach twisted in agony. As I got closer, I saw that the car had collided with another vehicle, and the impact had been brutal. The car's metal frame was mangled, and the windows were shattered. Blood was everywhere, smeared across the steering wheel and the dashboard. My wife's body was still inside the car, crumpled and lifeless. I felt like my entire world had come crashing down around me. My mind was numb with disbelief, and I could barely comprehend what had happened. I collapsed on the ground beside the car, tears streaming down my face as the reality of my wife's death sunk in. I kneeled beside her and cried, regretting everything I had done. The police and ambulance arrived, but it was too late. I had lost my wife forever. After her funeral, I decided to visit my girlfriend in that small town again. As I drove down the familiar road, my mind was preoccupied with thoughts of my late wife. I couldn't help but remember the tragic accident that took her life, the very same spot I was approaching. As I neared the area, my heart began to race, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. Then it happened. A gust of cold wind blew into my ear, making me shiver. My car started to shake, and I could feel my palms sweating on the steering wheel. I looked up in my rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold as I saw the figure of my wife sitting in the back seat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She looked exactly like she did on the day of her funeral. Her hair was neatly arranged, and she was wearing her favorite dress. I couldn't comprehend how this was possible. I was terrified, but I had to see what was happening, so I turned on the interior light. To my shock, there was nothing there. No sign of my wife, no physical evidence of what I had just seen. It was like a nightmare, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something beyond my understanding. I continued driving, but my mind was racing with questions and fears, wondering if I had just experienced something paranormal or if it was all in my head. I spent 2 days at my girlfriend's house before returning home. On my way back, I passed the same spot, and my radio suddenly turned static at maximum volume. It scared me to death, and I turned off the radio, thinking about my wife and all the mistakes I had made. As I drove back home, my mind was consumed with guilt and regret. The weight of my actions was now heavier than ever before. The image of my wife's lifeless body haunted me every moment. I had destroyed everything we had built over the years with one selfish decision. When I finally arrived home, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to gather the courage to face the reality of my situation. But there was no escaping the truth. I had lost the love of my life, and I was solely responsible for it. I spent the next few days and a days going through the motions of life without any real purpose or direction. I couldn't eat or sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw my wife's lifeless body staring back at me. But eventually, the reality of my situation forced me to face the truth. I had to take responsibility for my actions and find a way to make amends. I decided to seek help from a therapist, hoping that they could help me work through my grief and come to terms with my mistakes. The road to recovery was long and difficult, but with each passing day, I began to feel a sense of clarity and peace that I had never felt before. I started to see life in a different light and learned to appreciate the things that truly matter. Although I would never forget the pain and devastation I caused, I vowed to live the rest of my life in honor of my wife's memory. And even though I could never make things right, I knew that it was my duty to carry on and make the most of the time I had left. I remember feeling excited when I first saw her profile online. Her blonde hair cascaded down her shoulders in the picture, and her blue eyes sparkled. We started chatting, and our conversations quickly became a highlight of my day. I felt like we had a real connection and couldn't wait to meet her in person. After a month of chatting online, I decided to drive for hours to visit her. I was nervous and excited all at once. When I finally saw her in person, my heart sank. She looked completely different from her pictures. Her hair was shorter and darker, and her face looked completely different. It was clear that she had used Photoshop to enhance her photos. I felt disappointed and deceived, and I wished I had asked to video call her before visiting. But this was before the days of FaceTime and other video calling apps, so there was no way for me to see what she really looked like. But since we had been dating online for a while, I decided to stay for a day with her. However, when I got back home, I broke up with her. She cried and begged me on the phone, saying that she would never let me go. But eventually, I stopped hearing from her, and I assumed that she had moved on. The strange thing was that she wasn't online anymore. I began to wonder if she had hurt herself. One night, my brother went out and left me alone in the house. I was sleeping when I heard someone knocking on the door. I got up to check, but I saw no one. I went back to sleep, but the knocking got louder. I peered through the window, straining my eyes to see through the darkness, but all I could make out was a sinister emptiness. A chill crept down my spine, and I knew I had to investigate further. I cautiously made my way to the peephole, and what I saw was a sight that will haunt me forever. My girlfriend's face, drained of color and twisted in a ghastly expression, was staring back at me. I stumbled back in terror, my heart pounding in my chest. As I regained my composure and peered through the window again, there was still nothing there. I summoned all my courage and flung the door open, but the darkness swallowed me whole, leaving me alone with my fear and the knowledge that something sinister was lurking just beyond my sight. I got scared and went straight to cover myself with a blanket. The knocking on the door continued throughout the whole night. Morning finally came, and I felt relieved. Months later, I heard the news of a woman's suicide, and to my horror, it was my girlfriend. She had hung herself in her room, and no one had noticed until weeks later when her body was rotten. I checked the date when they found her body, and she had died days before the day I saw her at my front door. I realized that her ghost returned and searched for me. The thought of that night when I saw her through the peephole still haunts me in my nightmares. I had always dreamed of living in a small town, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. So, when I stumbled upon this quaint little town in California, I knew I had found my new home. But little did I know, this town held a dark secret. It all started a few months after I moved in. People began disappearing without a trace. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they had moved away or just wanted to start a new life somewhere else. But then, the news started reporting on it. They called him the Lonely Web Killer. He was a twisted individual who would kidnap people and torture them live on the deep web. The mere thought of it made my skin crawl. No one knew who he was or where he lived, but rumors began to circulate around town that he was hiding among us. People became paranoid and started locking themselves in their homes at night. Every night, I would hear strange noises outside my window, and I would wake up to find strange symbols etched into the walls of my house. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the fear kept growing inside me. I knew I had to do something before it was too late. I started investigating on my own, trying to gather any information I could about the Lonely Web Killer. The darkness enveloped me as I walked home from the library. The only sounds accompanying me were the eerie rustling of leaves and the faint hum of streetlights. Suddenly, a bone-chilling sensation crept up my spine as a cold, clammy hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, only to come face to face with a figure so terrifying that my blood turned to ice. It was the killer himself, with a twisted smile etched onto his face, as if he relished the fear he instilled in others. In one swift motion, he pulled out a gleaming, razor-sharp knife and held it menacingly in front of me. His breath was hot and reeking of death as he whispered in a hoarse, sinister voice, "You should have stayed out of this." I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan to escape the clutches of this monstrous being. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I was certain that my life was about to come to a gruesome end. The darkness around us seemed to have thickened, suffocating me and making it impossible to see a way out. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth and dragged me into the darkness. As he was dragging me, I realized that I had left my phone at home, so I couldn't call for help. My heart raced as I struggled to break free from his grip. Just when I thought it was all over, I felt a sudden jolt as the killer stumbled and fell to the ground. I turned around to see a group of people rushing towards me, including some of the locals who had banded together to catch the killer. The police arrived soon after and arrested the killer, who turned out to be someone I had never even suspected. It was a neighbor of mine who had always been quiet and kept to himself. The town slowly began to heal after the capture of the killer, but I couldn't shake off the trauma of what had happened. I knew I had to leave and start fresh somewhere else. I packed my bags and moved away from that small town, hoping to leave behind the memories of that dark time. But even now, years later, I can still feel the chill of that night, and I am always on the lookout for any signs of danger.